right? You know, a good spy is pretty hard to find because a good spy looks and sounds and talks and does everything else just like everyone else, right? Now, before we, let me see what I've got next here. So, a little bit of background information here. Why don't we go ahead and go through this? Now, this is a lot of information. I'm going to go through really fast, by my standards at least. So we go out, look at 1938. Fission is first, I should say, fission is first produced in Nazi Germany, 1938. Now, when I use a term like Nazi Germany, I imagine that there are several images that come into your mind. Pretty bad stuff, right? You think of Adolf Hitler barking. You might think of the Holocaust, concentration camps. You might think of the outbreak of World War II, which turned out to be by far the most costly war in history. That was the beginning of a terrible era. Now, the thing is, fission was first produced there. What does that tell you? Well, there's some pretty bright people there. Now, Hitler chased a bunch of them out of Germany, out of the continent altogether. Some of them ended up right here at Los Alamos. Some of them ended up in this room, among many other places. But anyway, they still had some very bright people there. That year, the Allies, or I should say, the other Europeans, the Brits, the French, they were desperate to appease the Germans. You've heard the term before, appeasement. They wanted to try and keep Hitler happy so that he wouldn't start World War II. Right? World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was the Great War. Nobody expected another one. One of the things that they gave him was an entire country, Czechoslovakia. They gave Hitler Czechoslovakia hoping that he would not start the war. Well, Czechoslovakia is a great place. Many nice things come with Czechoslovakia, including a lot of uranium ore that's in the mountains that borders with Germany. So when you think about it, the Germans have some very good scientists. They have access to uranium ore, direct access to uranium ore now. They had rebuilt illegally their heavy industrialized complex. You know, I think that you can make a really strong case that no country was better poised to build an atomic bomb in 1938 than Hitler's Germany. That's kind of the backdrop of the story today. Now, at this point in time, nobody recognized just how feasible and how close the technology of an atomic bomb was. And so many countries got off to very slow starts. Fortunately, the Germans never picked up much momentum. But anyway, here in this country, a couple of scientists decided to warn the president about these developments. The first was Leo Szilard, who almost nobody's ever heard of before. Back then, that was certainly the case. He knew that if he warned the president and sent a letter to him, the president would not see it, would he? You know, what happens if Alan Carr sends a letter to the president?
Nothing.
Yeah, nothing. How did you know? No, it doesn't go very far. Alan knows that, I know that. But what about Albert Einstein? If Albert Einstein sends a letter to the president, you think he might read it? Maybe so. That's a little bit different. And so Einstein agreed to write this letter with Szilard. Einstein signed it, and off it went to the president, warning him about what was going on. That was not the beginning of the Manhattan Project. That was still years away, but it was the earliest form of what would ultimately become the Manhattan Project a few years later. So anyway, the war starts about a month later. Germany invades Poland. Now you know that. You've seen the documentaries of the German soldiers marching in and all of that kind of stuff, right? You know. What a lot of people don't talk about anymore is what happened 17 days later. Anybody know what happened on September 17th, 1939? Right. And so the Soviet Union invades Poland from the other side. Now again, you know, we're not going to talk a lot about the Cold War today, but you know, the Soviets, they partnered with Hitler to cut Poland in half. The Soviets took Poland, their half of Poland that they never gave back. They invaded Finland a couple of months later. They annexed Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, large portions of Romania. So, you know, you kind of started to get a sense of what this guy Joseph Stalin is like from Ellen's remarks a while ago. Pretty bad guy. You know, when they invaded Finland, they didn't do very well. Probably the single main reason for that, there were many reasons, but maybe the most important one was that Stalin, in his fit of paranoia, also got rid of a lot of military officers. Probably more than 30,000 officers in the Red Army were either dismissed from service, sent to the Gulag system, sent to prisons, or simply executed. And so Stalin was very much his own worst enemy. But anyway, the world took note of that, saw how poorly the Soviets did against tiny Finland. The Germans took note of that too. Remember, they started off the war by cutting Poland in half. They were not really partners, but they agreed not to attack each other. Well, never make a deal with the Nazis, not a good idea. The Nazis didn't say that that non-aggression pact came with an expiration date, and so what was the largest invasion in the history of everything happened June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. About 7 million soldiers engaged each other along a front that ran from the Baltic to the Black Seas. 1,200 Soviet planes were destroyed the first morning of that campaign. So that's what's going on in Europe. Now we're going to go on out to the Pacific, and this is a date I bet everybody here in the room knows, December 7th, 1941. You know, I spoke with some people from Hiroshima TV yesterday, coincidentally, and they asked me what Americans thought about on August 6th, and I said, well, I don't know, barbecue, baseball. It's not a date that we think about. Of course, that was the day that Hiroshima was bombed. We think about dates like December 7th, 1941, right? Memorial Day, things of that nature. So it's a different perspective, completely different perspective. But anyway, we were at war. The United States had not been an active combatant up until that point in time. Now we were. The Japanese wanted a quick resolution to a decades-old Pacific problem. We had been rivals with each other in the Pacific. They wanted to own it. They didn't think we wanted to fight. We hadn't helped our friends in Europe. Surely we wouldn't fight back against the Japanese. Well, they made a major miscalculation there. And they got a prolonged war that they did not intend. Now, there's a lot of history between there and when the laboratory got set up in 1943. Don't have time for it today. But anyway, if you want to hear that, I do give talks basically on demand. I do birthday parties, bar mitzvahs. You know, give me a call. It's good for my job. But anyway, we go up to April 1943 and we have our first technical conference here in Los Alamos. The first technical conference, it was called the Primer Conference. Basically, we got all the guys together. What do we know? What do we know about nuclear physics? What do we know about critical mass? What are the odds of setting off a thermonuclear reaction? Questions like that. The questions that Oppenheimer outlined on the piece of junk mail that he got and that we still have over at the archives, not too far from here today. Pretty neat stuff. But we got underway, and in the approximately 28 months that followed, we designed, I say we, I'm the historian, so I get to use we, I have nothing to do with it. They were able to design 2 entirely different types of nuclear weapons in about 28 months. Just incredible. A remarkable engineering achievement. Of course, there were those 2 types. There was the little boy bomb, a uranium bomb, pretty simple. They knew it was going to work. They had tested every component of it. They felt that a full-scale test was not necessary. The other bomb was more complicated. It had plutonium as its fuel. It was an implosion bomb, more complex. They decided before we drop this thing over enemy territory, maybe we should make sure it works. And so they did a test. It was called the Trinity test, dubbed Trinity by Oppenheimer himself. I would argue that it's one of the most significant, certainly top 5, maybe the greatest scientific experiment of all time, the Trinity test. But it wasn't just a scientific experiment. It was the field test of a combat weapon as well. It was a success. You can see a photograph of it up there, the only color photograph of the Trinity test. That was taken by Jack Abbey, who passed away approximately 6 months ago, I believe. Unfortunately, we lost Jack. But anyway, that test produced a yield equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. Now think about that for a minute. 21,000 tons of TNT. We could deliver that kind of firepower on a target back then. But it took hundreds and hundreds of planes. It took hours and hours to do it. And people understood the technology. You know, if you see 1,000 planes coming, you sound the alarm. You can go and hide. You can send up your fighters. You can start shooting anti-aircraft at all those bombers. But with an atomic bomb, one bomb, one moment, a city can be completely destroyed. People have never seen anything like this before, and it would be completely revolutionary, not only for World War II, but for well beyond. It's still, this technology still continues to shape the world today. Let's talk very briefly about the end of World War II, and then we'll start talking about our spies. This deserves a lot more time than I'm going to give it. I apologize for that. It's a very significant, very important subject. But let's go to August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, Japan was attacked that day. The little boy type bomb, the gun-assembled uranium weapon, was used against that. The number that I have up there, 80,000 were killed immediately, that comes from the 1947 Strategic Bombing Survey. And if you follow this type of stuff, you'll see that casualty, fatality numbers are all over the place. I have chosen to use a different number now. This is an older presentation from the 1954 Army Pathological Study, a full scientific survey of this. They estimated that about 64,000 people had died by mid-November 1945 as a result of this attack. Now, everything that I've said so far is pretty clinical. I admit that. Now, getting aside from the statistic that you see up there, that's a pretty big number. Tens of thousands of people were killed. And you know, we talked yesterday with the folks from Japan quite a bit about this. There is certainly a different perspective there. Our perspective was that the war was still going on, a war that we didn't start, and a war that Japan could have chosen not to start in the first place or end on any given day. They chose not to. The war was still going on. It needed to be brought to an end. The atomic bombs were used as tools to help a much more complex process of bringing the Japanese government, of breaking their will finally to resist after all those terrible, terrible years. On August 8th, the Soviet Union, they were our allies. And again, they were our allies of convenience because the Germans had invaded their country. We didn't like the Soviet Union. We didn't trust the Soviet Union. There were not Soviet scientists here for two reasons. First of all, we didn't need them. There were several very good physicists in the Soviet Union, all right? But we didn't need them. The other thing, like I said, we did not like or trust them. You know, these are the guys that worked with Adolf Hitler to start World War II and protected Adolf Hitler's flank as he invaded the whole of Europe after that. Now, the Soviet Union had, again, the Japanese did not want a protracted war. They wanted a quick settlement, right? So they'd been interested in surrendering for several months leading up to this point, but they wanted to surrender on their terms. They had been trying to negotiate those terms through the Soviet Union. Who better than one of the allies that you're not fighting? So that was a pretty big diplomatic setback when the Japanese got that call late in the night of August 8th and said, hey guys, we're not going to be able to help you with that anymore. Sorry. Oh, and by the way, we're going to invade Manchuria tomorrow. Click. A few hours later, early August 9th, the Red Army moved into Manchuria. It had been redeployed, the Red Army had been redeployed from Europe all the way out to Siberia. In the invasion of Manchuria, about 84,000 Japanese soldiers died. This was another significant event in trying to get the Japanese to surrender. August 9th, I'm pretty sure, is the worst day in the history of Japan. It did not get any better because a few hours later, a second atomic bomb was unleashed against Nagasaki. That bomb was an implosion bomb. It was the type that they tested at Trinity. It was more powerful than Little Boy, but as you'll notice, fewer people were killed in that attack. The reason why is that they missed. I don't think it was anybody's fault, but you know, if you've seen Little Boy's a torpedo. I mean, it's ballistically perfect. You can see a picture of Fat Man there. That's a 6-foot diameter ball of high explosives. Over 5,000 pounds of high explosives. Now, would you want to try and stabilize that? What do you think you're going to hit with a big ball of explosives from 30,000 feet? That's going to be pretty tough. And so it tumbled off course, exploded over the outskirts of town, right over the Mitsubishi Armament factory. Completely took out the factory, but fewer civilians were killed because of where the bomb went off. But still, think about that. Really think about that for a moment. Think about what that must have been like. A new weapon, an irresistible weapon, a weapon that produced illnesses the likes of which no one had ever seen before and killed tens of thousands of people instantly. This was a pretty compelling weapon that was used against the Japanese. Well, the emperor himself, at this point in time, became much more active in trying to get the War Council to surrender. And lo and behold, they did. And the emperor addressed the people over the radio on August 14th, basically said, hey, things haven't really gone our way. It's been a little bit less than desirable lately. That's almost verbatim what he said, if you've read the speech, and I can send it to you if you'd like to see it. And by the way, the Allies have used a brand new, most cruel bomb, and so in order for me to save civilization, I'm going to bring the war to an end. Pretty smooth, huh? Anyway, there was no guarantee he'd get to keep his job. We kept him around and used him, and he cooperated. He was viewed basically as a deity in Japan, and it's kind of nice if you have the voice of God telling your soldiers to lay down their arms. And so that is very basically how the war ended. Back here at Los Alamos on October 16th, probably about 20 feet from where we are right now, that picture was taken. We received the Army-Navy E Award for excellence in wartime production. You can see Oppenheimer there receiving it from his boss, General Groves. He had to come back to receive that award. He had already left. He wanted to fade back into academia. It didn't quite work out that way. Norris Bradbury was the director, and he would remain the director until 1970. But that's a talk for a different day. But anyway, that is the backdrop. And World War II claimed between 60 and 80 million lives. 60 and 80 million lives, okay? Now, going back to what I mentioned before, spies talk. All this spy stuff, watching the movies, it's fun, it's cool, it's serious business. It's serious, serious business. And I think that, through Ellen's talk and some of this, you can begin to see that. Now, you came here for spies, and so I'm going to give you spies. Now, before I do, I wonder, has anybody seen the film? It's probably about 5 years old, if that, Bridge of Spies. So several, probably, okay, so maybe it was part of Science Fest. If you haven't seen it and you're not familiar with it, it's a Tom Hanks movie. And it starts basically with with one of our spy planes being shot down over the Soviet Union. This was Gary Powers, right, the brave pilot. And again, and I'm going to talk about it in just a minute, but I thought that was a good movie. I enjoyed that movie. There aren't that many great Cold War movies, and I enjoyed that one. There's a part in that movie where they're talking about spies and spying and things like that. The guy from the FBI, they captured this Russian spy, and they just want to throw the book at him, put him in prison for the rest of his life, this kind of thing. And Tom Hanks, who has the fun job of defending him, so everybody hates him, right? Because he's the guy defending the Soviet spy. He says, well, when you think about it, and I'm paraphrasing, watch the movie for yourself. Spying is a pretty honorable profession when you think about it. Now, here's the difference, though, that he made. If you're spying for your country, if you're like Gary Powers and you're in a plane at 70,000 feet over enemy territory, that's a pretty brave thing to do. That's pretty heroic. Trying to help our country, putting yourself in harm's way, that's pretty brave. I don't know if I'd want to be a spy in enemy territory, would you? That's a tough job. Now, here's the other side of it, though. What if you're spying against your own country? What if Gary Powers, instead of flying in that plane over the Soviet Union, was stealing secrets from the CIA? That's not very honorable, is it? So it's different perspectives from different people. Again, I think spying is pretty important and honorable profession. I think spying against your own country, well, there's a term for that. It's called treason, right? And so we're going to meet some of these folks. They've got pretty different backgrounds. They're not all Americans. A couple of them are, but not all of them. Let's meet our spies to start out. So number one, the boy genius, Ted Hall. So why don't I, one thing I should point out first is when I put this talk together in the first place, it was commissioned by our security people at the laboratory. These were insiders. We're going to get to that at the end. But the insider threat is the most significant threat because it's tough to get somebody like Tom Cruise to volunteer to hang from the ceiling full of motion detectors and lasers and, laser shooting alligators or whatever they are. Yeah, So anyway, let's look. I want to encourage you. We're all going to be investigators right now, right? So it's Science Fest. So you're going to be an FBI agent. Look for common threads among our spies. How would you pick out a spy? How would you keep something like what you're about to see from happening? Well, first of all, Ted Hall was born October 20th, 1925 in New York City. So, there's your first clue. Now, I'm from Central Texas. I grew up in Waco. I went to school in Lubbock. That alone looks pretty suspicious to me. Okay, so it doesn't mean anything in and of itself, but, might want to keep an eye on this guy. Next, in 1944, kind of the middle of the project here at Los Alamos, Ted Hall graduated from Harvard at the age of 18. You remember what you were doing when you were 18? I remember what I was doing, and it wasn't graduating from Harvard. Pretty bright kid here, right? Very, very talented. He joined our staff, and he was a relatively junior staff member. He's probably about it's like 18, 19, about 19 years old, I think, when he got here. He performed work relevant to both bomb types. What he did were critical mass studies. So this is almost literally at the heart of building an atomic bomb. If you're going to build an atomic bomb, you need to know how much fissile material you need, right? That amount of fissile material that you need is the critical mass. He, despite being young, despite being a very junior staff member, was right there in the midst of things doing critical mass studies that affected how we would design both weapons. So he had access, as you can imagine, to some very, very sensitive information. In October 1944, he voluntarily shared classified information with the Communist Party of America. Now, the question I'm going to ask you right now is, rhetorically, because we'll talk about it later, why would he do that?